shot. Bend. Bend. I hark back, and I hope it isn't a sort of a rosy view of it, to the early days in Ballymurphy. You know, when I was in my late teens and we were trying to organise, we were banned, there were very few Republicans. And then within 10 months, it changed. And for me, one of the best periods of my activism was in that 69, 70, when the entire community of the greater Ballymurphy area rose up and defeated the British Army with stones and bottles and bin lids, and they were so well organised. There were youth committees, there were women's committees, a resistance council, and worked out things and managed their own affairs to the best of their ability. And politics is not worth anything unless it empowers people. I suppose if you really believe in something, then you got to do something about it. So make a stand. Resistance was a person refusing to give their name to a British soldier. It was a person intervening when some young fella was beaten up by a passing British Army patrol. It was somebody giving their name in Irish. It was attending rallies, marches, protests. I don't just mean armed resistance. I mean in all its forms, people responding to oppression and interference and a lack of rights.
Just to make everybody aware that there is a film crew in today. They are making a documentary that will be seen, hopefully worldwide, in cinemas. So if anyone doesn't want to be their face included or whatever, just...
Okay, Dave. First of all, I think that everybody has a story to tell. And I think that everybody's story should be told. Use a tape recorder. Tape record or whatever, use your phone. People probably don't know what a tape recorder is. So tape your Grammy or your Granda. Get them to tell you what it was like when they were growing up. I can easily, I'm 74, so I can easily remember back 65 years. So my parents could remember 30 years before that. And their parents 30 years before that. And some of you who still have, 2 or 3 generations living, before you know it, you're back to the time of the Great Hunger with an living memory. And then all of what we've been through here in this part of the world for the last 40 or 50 years. I'm often asked if I ever have doubts about what I do and about the struggle and so on. And of course I do. It would be, you wouldn't be a thinking person at all if you didn't have doubts and didn't have regrets. Another certainty in my life is that I still have a sense of outrage at the fact that this country of Ireland is divided and partitioned, that an English government deems that it has some right to control our affairs. I've often reflected about when Ireland was partitioned, which is almost 100 years ago, how the people in the north particularly must have felt. What on earth is an English government doing in Ireland? What on earth gives it any right to partition the island? I mean, I wouldn't for a moment think that I should be taking decisions for people in Sussex or Essex or Glasgow or anywhere else. That's their business. I have the arrogance to go and take control of somebody else's country and run it as they ran it. And, you know, very much this is about the reconquest of Ireland by the people who live here. If you're burdened with what we had in the north, or if you're burdened with colonialism of any kind, or with discrimination of any kind, then you can't get on with your life. And poverty is so heavily weighing down on you that everything's a stress. And part of colonising people is to depict them as being subhuman or in some way inferior. One of the lovely phrases that arises when the English came into Ireland was they came to civilise the barbarians. The most insidious type of colonisation is cultural, where you colonise people's minds, so you do away with their language, with their values, with their mores and so on. And for as long as there has been an English involvement in Ireland, an English government involvement, they've had a penal policy. Yep. Ireland has been under colonial rule for so long, and we're going through a process now of decolonisation. We do have a certain reputation for standing up for people's rights, as rightly or wrongly. You know, it might be a false perception about the Irish, but we do have that reputation. I actually get great pleasure when I'm walking in the park or on the mountain, reflecting on the fact that I was doing the same thing 60 years ago or 65 years ago. These are the things that have always been in your life. I mean, even the same trees are there. Even if the park's landscape changes, there's some things that don't change, and the thing that never changes, except in its colouring and in its moods, are the Belfast Hills. I spent part of the Christmas break on the Black Mountain doing exactly what I did when I was 10-year-old. And there's a sense of connectedness, of familiarity, of belonging. I spent a lot of my time with my Granny Adams. It wasn't unusual for large families almost to foster out the oldest girl or the oldest boy to live with a grandparent. My Granny Adams lived in number 15, Upper Corn Street North. And Upper Corn Street North ran at a right angle to Leeson Street. It's a small terrace of houses, as were all the streets, built for mill workers and built in the shadow of the mill. I say this quite often. We were very poor, but nobody noticed because everybody was poor. You had no sense of, that's the way that it was. My granny was what they called a half-timer. She went one day to school, one day to work when she was a child in the linen mills. My mother worked in the linen mills as well. I was hugely influenced by my Granny Adams. I remember she had a chair like this in her little living room, and she had a board across it for me to do my homework on. I remember sitting with my books on this little improvised desk, she insisting that I do whatever homework I had to do before I did anything else. And I accompanied her to the library. She loved reading, and she would go diligently to the Carnegie Library, and I would be in tow with her, and she would get her library books, and I would get my library books, and that introduced me into a lifelong love of reading. We read a lot of English comics, the Vino and the Dandy and Roy of the Hotspurs and Biggles, and the only sort of Irish, it wasn't quite a comic, was a magazine called Our Boys, would have dealt with hurling and football and legends like Finn McCool or Cuchulainn or told those little yards. It's just a great joy, and the way words can uplift you and stories can take you off to somewhere else. The neighbourhood was very working class, terraced houses, no inside toilet, no inside kitchen, small scullery, water tub in the yard, very small dwellings. Sometimes, as it was in our case, a couple of family units sharing, would have been 3 rooms, I suppose, maybe 2 rooms. The Falls was also riddled with little stables. People kept fowl, poultry. My granny had chickens, quite a normal thing, and every second street had stables. We had a horse for a while. We spent a huge amount of time in the street, and street life also involved what now be called the rag and bone man, a man walking around the streets calling out for any old rags. Milk was delivered in the same way. The hoppy horseman would have come around. Street singers singing the popular songs of the day, mostly American or Irish. And there was a pub at every corner, and probably another 2 pubs between every corner. There was a very acute sense of neighbourliness. I mean, it was very common that if a meal was made, that it was shared with someone next door. That a dish was sent over to the old woman across the street. That was common. There were eventually 13 of us. 3 little brothers died just shortly after they were born. And my mother got a house in Ballymurphy. So I would have been up there for the weekend with my brothers and sisters. We're talking now about the mid-1950s. Ballymurphy was a very typical working class housing estate. A lot of unemployment, basically acres of houses without any shopping facilities, sports facilities, educational facilities. It was wide open, it was big skies, it was the mountain, it was the river. Sectarianism in the north is one of the huge untackled issues. My first experience of sectarianism was actually being challenged by a couple of Catholic boys. who thought I was a Protestant, and them asking me to recite the Hail Mary or some such prayer. The elites, those who generally rule us or govern us, thrive on division. It's also part of the human condition that sometimes people are afraid of or recoil against others who are different. That feeling which is exploited. The old adage of divide and conquer. Like Belfast is still one of the most segregated cities, certainly in Western Europe. So in other countries it was race or colour, and in our case it was creed. Most of the people in Ireland were Catholic and they were Protestant. And it's an entirely false, artificial division. But I don't recall any real open political consciousness. My first real awareness was in 1964. There was an election. The Sinn Féin was a banned organisation. They had an office in a shop front in Divis Street. They put the Irish national flag, which is banned at that time under the Flags and Emblems Act and the Special Powers Act. And Ian Paisley, who was a young up-and-coming demagogue, threatened to go in and take the flag out if the RUC didn't do so. The RUC did so. The Republicans put the flag back in. Myself and the other scholars were walking back and forth along that route, and that was my first consciousness, because the RUC came in very, very large numbers, and there were 2 or 3 days of street conflict, of rioting. I went and got a copy of the Special Powers Act because I wanted to see what this was all about. I read the thing and realised then there was something a bit mad about this part of the world. I was 15. In 1966, there was the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising. All commemorations of a public kind in the North were banned. But on the other side, there was also the popularisation of the writings of the leaders of 1916. The writings of Connolly were published, of Padraig Pearse were published. At this point, I'm reading political stuff, trying to get a context of all of this. I definitely have the bug for trying to figure out what was wrong and what you do about it. And my first, I suppose, big decision was to leave school. I saw an advertisement in the Irish News, the local newspaper, a position for a bartender, for an apprentice, which I have to say, for the short time I was in it, I enjoyed. It was a working class unionist neighbourhood. The people were the salt of the earth. They treated me very well. There was a lot of joking and slagging because I was obviously a Catholic or a wee Fenian, but it was all said in the most inoffensive and jocular way. I left the Ark bar after a short period, and I worked in a bar called the Duke of York. It was the first time I became acquainted with coffee. They had a coffee percolator, and this was a wonderful machine. And the Duke of York bar was a place where journalists from the newsletter, from the BBC, where trade union officials, were members of the old Northern Ireland Labour Party, where the Communist Party accumulated. There was a lot of music in the pub at the weekends. There were sing-songs. And you got a big break in the middle of the day of about 4 or 5 hours. So I would have went off on a protest. And a lot of the protests then were small protests. You're now approaching 1968. The civil rights struggle had started. And the first big campaign that I was involved in was around housing. There were 2 issues: the dreadful homelessness and the bad conditions of those who had a home. And then secondly, plans to redevelop the falls. The plan to redevelop the falls was to get rid of all the old neighbourhood and to replace it with high-rise flats. A gang of us who by now were politically active decided in our wisdom that high-rise flats weren't the answer, that the old neighbourhood should be retained and the community should be retained. One of the first things we did was we had a meeting with the people in what was a lonely area, the people of that part of the falls, to see what they wanted. And that has stayed with me all of my political life, that it has to be about empowerment of people, that people have to have ownership, and which people involved will resist if they're given the opportunity or have the leadership to do so.
And he says, look, I do 40 hours a week, and you make a great deal of profit out of my labour, and I'm entitled to a better wage.
Freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. We do not wish bloodshed or violence.
I think what marked out the 60s as different, it was the age of television. It was also global. The power of the television was bringing to us the American civil rights movement, the students' uprising in Europe, just the music of the time, the sense of all that was happening, that we were part of something bigger than just what was happening in the North. The right to a vote, the right to not to be discriminated against, the right to a job, that these were human rights and civil rights. In 1969, there's a political earthquake here. The whole situation changes. And huge parts of Belfast became barricaded areas. I think actually there were 27 barricaded areas across Belfast. The whole community became almost activists. So the barricades had to be staffed, food deliveries and cleaning of the streets and emptying of the bins. All of that had to be in some way accommodated in the middle of this big political crisis.
Could you tell us what the barricade is for?
To stop British intelligence agents, RUC special branch, coming into the area, keeping people who we don't want out, you know.
So Ballymurphy had a communal response to all of that, and I'm very pleased that I was part of that type of communal response. Very, very democratic and very, very inclusive and very involving of everybody who wanted to be involved locally. It was a popular uprising. When the Battle of the Bogside started, the first we knew of it was just through the media, the bloom went up. This was a very, very public defiance, mostly young people, but not exclusively young people. The RUC were repelled from the Bogside, barricades were put up. The images that were impacting were of young people on the top of the Rossable Flats throwing petrol bombs or stones. This went on for some days. But then I noticed we had doctors in demonstrations with us, with teachers in demonstrations with us, with people who, you know, for whatever reason, had not been active before. If you go back even 10 years to what I have described as almost a passive acceptance by the bulk of the nationalist population, a sense of perhaps helplessness or not being able to do anything about it. And then all of a sudden here you had what appeared to be the entire community of the Bogside in open rebellion. It was like day and night, and a sense of things just heading to some point of huge decision. I then went up to Ballymurphy, which was more my area of activism. We could hear the noise of shooting, and I went back down the falls. And the falls was like a apocalypse now. The earlier attacks were loyalist, unionist mob who were led by uniformed members of the B Specials. The Falls was also the scene of such sectarian attacks 100 years before. Exactly the same places where people were chased out of or attacked or killed because they were Catholic. This had been a recurring issue for perhaps a year before, where individual Catholic families may have been burnt out or had an axe put on their door, or intimidated, or a brick put through their window. But this was more of mass attacks. So acts of random sectarianism were increasing. If you raise people on the basis of we are the people, what we have we hold, no surrender, not an inch, that if you give a right to someone else, to a job, they're going to take your job. The other side's always seen as a threat.
What do Catholics matter to you?
Nothing at all.
Do you know any Catholics?
No.
Would you like to know any Catholics?
No.
Why not?
Don't like them.
Why? Well, if you don't know any, how do you know you don't like them?
Just see them on the TV fighting with battles and all. That's all I know about them, and I don't want to know about them.
Any Catholics at your school? No.
No.
No, they all go to their own schools.
Yes.
You met a little boy and you liked him and you suddenly discovered he was a Catholic. What would you do?
Go away from him again.
Why would you do that?
Because he's a Catholic.
There is still to this day a strand of fundamentalism within a section of Northern Protestantism which doesn't recognise Catholics. The economic conditions in Shankill Road were the same as economic conditions in the Falls Road. It was a case of tuppence halfpenny looking down on tuppence. It was like the poor whites in the southern states of the USA looking down upon the poor blacks, where in fact there might not have been such a big difference between their economic conditions when it was all boiled down. Within months, the British troops which were brought in to maintain the status quo, there's this sort of pretense, and sometimes even well-minded people will say they were brought in to defend the Catholics. They were not brought in to defend the Catholics. They were brought in to relieve the RUC, which was exhausted by this point. They were brought in to uphold the system as it then prevailed. And then, as months went by, the troops, any pretense of there to defend anybody, faded. Into Ballymurphy arrived hundreds of families, hundreds fleeing with nothing. From East Belfast, from South Belfast, from North Belfast. They land into West Belfast. The community under the Central Citizens Defence Committee, the Ballymurphy Defence Committee, the Ballymurphy Tennis Association, the local Republican organisations, the Sinn Féin organisation, opened up the schools. The churches worked as well. Refugee centres were established. People had to be accommodated. Local people just opened up their homes and took these families in. And then parts of West Belfast which were being developed and which weren't finished, local tradesmen came and fixed up the electricity, fixed up the water, finished off the houses in some shape or form. Ballymurphy became a place which was entirely different from what had preceded it. The British Army were organised in what they called duck patrols. That was the British name for these big patrols that went out and just saturated an area. They were aggressive, and as local people resisted that, then the women of Ballymurphy organised what they called hand patrols. So when a duck patrol came out, it was accompanied by women who shouted, rattled dustbins, saucepans, pots, pans, cans, tins, anything to both annoy the soldiers but also to alert the community that the British troops were in the neighbourhood. Ongoing street fighting between the local community and the British troops. People in the community played some small part or other in it. Like, for example, the Brits saturated the area with CS gas, and someone came up with the bright idea that you could repel the CS gas, or at least it would have less of a bad effect on you if you had wet cloths dipped in vinegar. So every house had a basin outside its door or a bucket outside its door with cloths, tea cloths and towels soaked in vinegar for the rioters. Young men used to occasionally use hurling sticks to puck to strike the CS gas canisters back at the troops. And that was a daily occurrence for at least a year. And the community became quite expert at resisting the British. And remember now, this is part of what's called the United Kingdom.
This country will be free. There's no mistake about that. And we're determined to fight for it, make sure that it will be free. And the British will leave this, they'll leave this part of the world for good, and they'll not come back again.
The IRA used to be from 70s on for a period. That's where, certainly in the north, the young people went. You know, that's the young men and young women from these nationalist and Republican communities. I don't want to be ageist at all, but struggle needs young people. It needs their energy, their idealism, the creativity. Every human organisation needs to regenerate itself, and all the time allow those new generations then to find their own modes and their own ability and their own methods of struggle and moving it forward. That community which I've been a child of and grew up in and went to school in, and I still have relatives to this day, was placed under curfew. And it started off after a house raid and quickly escalated to a complete lockdown. They put choppers up to tell people that the area was under curfew.
You have 5 minutes to get outside the court. Otherwise, if you are still on the street, you will be liable to arrest.
I'd At one point, they brought a unionist representative on the back of a Land Rover to tour the area. And if anything was sort of reminiscent of, an apartheid or a colonial or an imperial situation, I think that said it all. The local functionary, the local government official was brought around the conquered area to show how the people were subdued. They weren't allowed to leave their homes. Their homes were being raided and wrecked. And there were children and there were women and others who were being denied foodstuffs and so on. So women, most notably Maura Drum and Marie Moore, descended on the falls with foodstuffs. The media attention, the fact again that this was televised, you can see like rivers of women just sweeping away British soldiers just with righteous indignation as they make their way through and liberate the area. Women didn't fire any shots. Women didn't throw any bombs. Women just arrived in, and just by sheer dint of their presence and their refusal to accept that they were going to be told what to do because they were being threatened by armed soldiers. Very courageous. That wasn't an easy thing to do because people had been killed. In the early 60s to 1968 into 69 and particularly into 1970, there were street committees in every street in Ballymurphy, and people met, took ownership, took responsibility, organised themselves, debated, argued. That's how I first met Colette, probably early 1970. Maybe in July 1971, I asked her would we go out. And she said yes. People in Ballymurphy never went to war. The war came to us. I mean, there were 600 people from the greater Ballymurphy area imprisoned. There were 11 died over the period of the Ballymurphy massacre. 10 of them shot dead, 1 of them died after being accosted by British paratroopers. The paratroopers went on months later into Derry on Bloody Sunday to commit exactly the same actions. And it was part of British policy. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't a rogue regiment, it was part of British policy, part of the counterinsurgency strategy. In total, in the greater Ballymurphy area, 150 people died, killed by all the different forces that were involved, and upwards of 1,000 were wounded in the course of the conflict. So this quite small community were subjected to the most brutal 30 years of military occupation, including the killing and wounding of our neighbours and our friends.
Nick Schiffer is building everywhere, but with the most powerful QuickBooks ever on the Insware platform, his crew of AI agents help him nail it.
Nick, 10 payments arrived.
All in one place.
Hey boss, contracts are ready.
That's his blueprint. Outdo it with Insware QuickBooks.
Tired of looking tired? Erase it with Revitalift Instant Eye Bag Eraser, our #1 eye cream with a gel-to-tape technology that erases eye bags in just 15 minutes. Visible results on all skin tones. Revitalift Instant Eye Bag Eraser by L'Oréal Paris.
The big one from Ariel is way bigger than a regular pod. Big miss, big deal. Big spill, big deal. Big landing, big deal.
The big one from Ariel. With double stain and odour removal, all those big messes really are no
big deal.
The big one from Ariel. Always keep away from children.
When daily dust gets in the way, it's time for Flash. Dust magnets. Effective on 100% of dust, it works like a powerful magnet to trap and lock dust, even in those hard-to-reach places. With the dust-locking power of Flash Dust Magnet, it's game over for dust. Flash Dust Magnet, back to clean in a flash.
As a chef, I know exactly what a healthy, balanced meal looks like. But did you know, most of us aren't getting enough omega-3 in our diets? Life isn't always balanced, even for me. So I take 7Seas, the UK's #1 omega-3 brand, to help me top up my omega-3 levels. It's an important nutrient that helps support my heart, brain and vision. Because I want to keep doing what I love, even though my diet isn't always perfect. 7Seas omega-3. Keep doing what you love.
Waiting. Waiting. Wait. What if you were driving to a charming hotel in the countryside? Go on, book it. It's easy. Booking.com. Booking.yeah. Clat and I were in a house in Glenlina Road. We'd gone there for shelter, and then all of a sudden there were troops all around us, and we were sitting in a room with the family of the house, and we could hear the troops, and we could hear the English accents, and we could hear the doors getting kicked in, the windows getting smashed. We could hear women screaming, we could hear shots, we could hear troops just outside the window opening fire. I said to Clad that night, if we get out of this, I think we should get married. Six weeks later, Clad and I were married. Father Des Wilson married us in the back of St. John's after one of the normal masses. We were married in the sacristy. I was late. I was at a meeting up in Andersonstown, and I actually forgot that I was to be married, so I charged in. And we went off. Two of our friends came with us, and we had two days in Dublin, and then back on the run again. When people were arrested, they were dragged from their beds, dragged from their homes. Some men were dragged out in their pajamas or in their underwear, some in their bare feet, some weren't even given the time to dress. And stories quickly came out about them being beaten, about them being assaulted. It led to immediate protests. Operation Demetrius was the name given to internment. It was internment without trial. The people ended up interned who weren't anything, just happened to be in the wrong family or in the wrong place at the wrong time or have been spotted in the company of a Republican. That was enough. Republicans would have been on the run. At the time, Sinn Féin was a banned organisation, and that ban wasn't lifted on until the mid-1970s. Internment probably brought the whole thing to, once again, to another level. I mean, there were hundreds of men interned, and probably through the period of internment, perhaps thousands. There were probably about 30 to 46 women imprisoned. If you're a sentenced prisoner, even though you have a date which might be 2 centuries away, you have a date. So you're doing time, long sentence, short sentence, you have a date. When you're interned, you could be released any day. Even though some people were interned for years, they always live in the hope that you're going to be released the next day. And the jail is also full of rumours. It's going to be over by Christmas. I've just got word that Halloween we're all going to be released. My solicitor told me it won't last beyond August. Because there was so much protest, there was so much controversy. I was arrested. I was taken to Palace Barracks. I was beaten for all of the period I was in Palace Barracks. And, you know, there were attempts to frighten you and intimidate you. I was brought into an interrogation suite and spread-eagled on the wall and just beaten unconscious and beaten repeatedly. So I was then brought to the Maidstone. When young cattle are held indoors over the winter and they're let out in the spring into the field, they go nuts. Just a sense of freedom. When we were taken off the Maidstone into Longcash, that's what we were like. We could see sky. Obviously our vision was blocked by the wire, but it was just a sense of freedom, even though we were in prison. Somebody out here spotted somebody who he thought looked remarkably like me. I had long hair and a beard, so I shaved my beard surreptitiously and put on a false beard and got my hair cut very short and put on a wig, and then made myself out to the visiting box where this guy was visiting me. He would put on the wig and the beard and go back in to the cage instead of me, and I would go out clean shaven and neatly haircutted. But when I met him in the visiting box, I'm 6'1", he was about 5'4". So it was a bit of absurdity for a moment or two. And the spur of the moment, we decided that would go, you know, we'll try it anyway, right? And I always remember in the court case, the prison officer said when he was going in, we were looking down at him, and when we was coming out, we were looking up at him. So I was caught. It was an attempted escape which went wrong, and it was good fun. I think it's worth saying that if you're involved in struggle, that there may be a trigger point or some event that brings you into activism, but there are then subsequent recommitments. When you come out of prison, if you're in prison, you have a decision to make as to whether you go back into activism. Then again, you have to make that choice. I was released in June. It was 1972. I was very surprised when I was sent for and I was told I was being released. I went out and Dolars and Marion Price were in a car outside, that I was to be involved in some sort of talks and that I was going to Gerry to meet with Daithí O'Connell. Daithí O'Connell was at that point a senior member of Sinn Féin and also reputedly a senior member of the IRA. This was to be the opening of discussions with the British about a potential truce. The day arrived to go and meet the Brits in London, which was the first time I met Martin McGuinness. He also was part of the delegation. We were taken by chopper and we flew down to Aldergrove. Seamus Toomey was part of the delegation as well. We were taken on up the gangplank, the gangway, to this RAF plane. And it was a bit of a joke between myself and Martin that the RAF captain saluted him on the way in. I used to always joke, and Martin saluted him back again on the way in. And we went to a place that we weren't in for another 40 years. Thinking back on now, it was decidedly the arrogance of youth that I went in an open neck shirt and quite a shabby V-necked jumper. Just quite almost as an act of rebellion that I wasn't going to get dressed up to meet the Brits. That might have been very juvenile and might have been very immature, but that was my sense of it.
That we respect the wishes of these people who are involved in the peace movement, and we will defend their right to speak in Free Derry and otherwise.
So you will listen to what they've got to say to you?
Certainly, we will listen at all times to all classes of people.
How strong do you think this movement is?
This movement is very strong. Most of our supporters are in it too, but our supporters would like to make it clear that the provisional IRA will not stop the fight until the three demands that we have put to Mr. Whitelaw are met.
It was very straightforward. It was about what the terms of a truce would be. It was about getting talks with the British about the future. We didn't have any political strategy. We had political demands, and we clearly had a political vision, but we didn't have a program to take us from where we were to where we needed to be. And I thought the British were exploring more than anything else. It wasn't a very long meeting. We left and they were to go and reflect on what had been put to them, which was about a British declaration of intent to withdraw.
If Mr. Whitelaw and his government are sincerely interested in peace, then they'll be prepared to discuss our terms with us.
We met Mr. Whitelaw and members of his political staff. Mr. Whitelaw went back to Ted Heath, who was Prime Minister at the time, showed them our document, our proposals. Ted Heath read them and turned around and said, well, I don't think there's anything can be done here. You'd better break the truce as soon as you can. And in fact, the truce broke on the following Sunday night. It nearly broke that morning in Portadown.
There were a couple of disastrous IRA operations. The British exploited that and they kicked off Operation Waterman, which saw the saturation of nationalist areas by British forces. So the amount of British troops, never mind IUC officers, in the north, perhaps upwards of 30,000, becomes even more magnified when you consider that they were generally deployed in nationalist areas. They established posts, barracks, spy towers in all the strategic places in the area, on all the main routes in the area. And in the Ballymurphy area, for example, it was totally surrounded by British forts. And then as things moved on, they started to use more and more electronic means of surveillance. They also more proactively engaged in covert operations. The law did become just part of an arsenal of the state, and you had a conveyor belt of people being arrested, right to silence being removed, forced confessions being acceptable as evidence, beatings being acceptable. I was rearrested in 1974. On this time I was beaten even worse than previously, and for a very, very, very long time. I remember the irony of the situation that when I was unconscious they would get a British Army doctor to come in to check me to show that I was fit for another beating. I was arrested with Brendan Hughes. And when we eventually got back to Longcash, we couldn't move for days. We were black and blue from head to foot. But I was shipped then to the Stanton's end of the prison and into Cage 11. It was like going from a fun house to a monastery. Because the prisoners in the Stanton's end were long-term prisoners, mostly, they had their own routine. And they'd been together, some of them, for X amount of years, and they'd another 10 or 15 or 20 years to do. The structure for the prisoners in the top end of the camp was quite rigid and quite regimented. The prisoners paraded at a certain time. And of course you need to have some form of discipline, because here you have a huge amount of men. They're housed in communal areas. So you would have young men with older men, urban guys with old country farmers, people from all sorts of different backgrounds and generations. The vast majority of these folks would never have been in prison in their lives if it wasn't for their political situation. That's where I first met Bobby Sands. He's a very ordinary guy, like just average size, long hair, good singer, teaching himself the guitar, a decent guitar player, and he was also a Gaeilgeoir. He was an Irish language speaker. I was persuaded, against my best intentions and best wishes and all the rest of it, that I would come forward and take up the leadership of Cage 11, because the Cage was quite split, and I didn't want to do it, but I eventually relented and said I would do it. We started to loosen up on some of the stuff, but we started to have discussions, about struggle, about republicanism, about Ireland, about unionism, about other struggles in other parts of the world. We actually got permission to form a Sinn Féin Common in the Cage, and we sent proposals to the Ardèche, and we had our own mini Ardèche in the Cage. Claire was pregnant, so when I was arrested, she was carrying a child. And I remember when Groyd was born, Gerry Kelly, another Republican, whose wife Isabel was also pregnant. They got the two of us confused, and they went in to Gerry and told him that he was the father of a baby boy. Of course, he wasn't. He was subsequently the father of a baby boy within about a week or within days. When Clet brought the child up to the visit, we were surrounded by other prisoners and friends of ours who all thought the child looked like him. So it was all that banter and messing and so on. Groyd was 4.5 when I was released from prison, so our relationship up to that point was on prison visits. I came out of prison and we went away. We went away actually the very same day that I got out. We went and stayed with friends in Dublin for a night or two. And then we went to the Zoological Gardens. I don't know if he remembers it. I certainly remember the long walks and the fun that we had, and tramping over fields and having them up on my shoulders and wading across rivers with them on my shoulders and hunting for monsters and crocodiles and all of that stuff. You know, marriages are broken up under the pressure. Children mightn't thank their parents for their absences for long periods. I'm one of the lucky ones that would come through it all, but others haven't, and it's a very, very high price for somebody to pay, that maybe in the course of devoting themselves to a cause that they might lose a family, or lose a son, or lose a daughter, or lose a partner. The Brits were hints that they were going to end special status. We were special category prisoners. So they had an open propaganda which depicted the struggle as being criminal. But how could they do that if there were camps full of political prisoners? So they had to criminalise the prisoners.
Well, the British government have declared war in this country. And there is a war going on in this country. We believe, as I'm saying, as a prisoner, that we are in there for political reasons.
The prisoners had solidified their demands into what were called the 5 demands. And they were basically humane prison conditions. The right to education, the right to free association, the right to wear your own clothes. So what they were asking for wasn't extraordinary. But it quickly crystallised as the age-old battle between that section of Irish people who were resolute about the right to be free, and a British government which was resolute about denying that right. It is very hard to describe what meeting a blanket man is like. They were naked. Some of them wore the blanket poncho style. Some of them were draped around them. All of them had long hair, those who had hair, long beards. Some were kids, long straggly, bum fluff. All were pale as death. All were thin. They were parchment white because they were locked up continuously. And within a short period, there were 500 or 600 men.
Political prisoners! We want political status! We're political prisoners! Political status!
The prisoners were denied the right to stop out and denied the use of toilet facilities. That became the No Wash protest. But rather than it being an escalation by the prisoners of the protest, it was actually just a reality. They had nowhere else to put their urine except onto the cell doors because they were being denied the right to go out. And as they were denied toilet facilities, they had nowhere else to put their excrement except smeared on the walls of the cells. It was in fact a consequence of them being denied the right to wash and toilet facilities. There were maggots living in the mattresses. The prison authorities used to wash out the cells using high-powered hoses and also bleach and disinfectant and so on. And they also used to forcibly wash the prisoners using back scrubbers and scrubbing brushes and so on. And many prisoners were injured in the course of all of that. The older people in the prison decided that it couldn't go on for much longer and they would go for a hunger strike. There's something about the hunger strikes which I have never been able to properly come to terms with, which makes people of my generation, and particularly those of us who were very, very close to the prisoners, very emotional. And I suppose part of it, if you could analyse it, is got to do with that this was one person against an empire, or a regime which thought it was an empire. The political society and wider society in Ireland was divided by the hunger strikes. All of these issues that, the revisionists and those who were anti-republican had tried to erase from our memories this relationship between a British government and the people of the island of Ireland, the partition of the island. All of these issues all started to come back into play. The prisoners had their way and the hunger strike ahead, and the women were on hunger strike along with the men. One of the prisoners, Sean McKenna, became very seriously ill. And Brendan Hughes, and who was on hunger strike himself, he was leading the hunger strike, became very perturbed that Sean may die just before a potential settlement was reached. And he ended the hunger strike. The proposals which the British had made, they wouldn't have been the type of proposals that the prisoners were looking for. You wouldn't have been satisfied with what was being on offer. But within a short time, Bobby Sands and others were urging that there be another hunger strike. Bobby Sands didn't want to die on hunger strike. Read any of his personal letters, his poetry, the poems he wrote to his mother. So Bobby didn't want to die on hunger strike, but he knew unless Thatcher was prepared to meet the prisoners halfway, even in terms of dealing with these issues, that he was going to die on hunger strike. He knew that. And to pit himself against the regime in the way that he did, and the other 9 prisoners. When the second hunger strike started, the women, despite huge protestations from them, were persuaded not to go on second hunger strike. I suppose some of them to this day resent that. But Bobby started the hunger strike. We on the outside knew that there would be a period of almost wait and see. It was only when he got to the point of being seriously ill that public attention would be focused.
We have asked for the rights and human dignity of our prisoners. That's all. We are not afraid to have done that. And if we pay for those demands with the life of one prisoner.
There was one big watershed moment in the course of the hunger strike. That was Bobby's election as the MP for Fermanagh South Tyrone. And it was a big decision. Say he did badly. You know, could he actually win? And if he didn't win, would that be seen as a defeat for the prisoners? By the time it came to the night before the count, I knew that Bobby had won. I just knew it. I had arranged to meet Colette and our son Gerry in the Cooley Mountains to have a day with them. I was driving along a road and the news came. And there wasn't another car on the road. And I remember pounding the roof of the car and squealing and shouting and yelling at the top of my voice when we got news that he was elected. And that was a huge vindication of the assertion that these were not criminals, and a huge put down to Thatcher.
Sam Bobby, anti-H block, Armagh, political prisoner, 30,492. And I declare that Bobby Sam has been duly elected to serve as a member for the third constituency.
Bobby Sands is dead. The 27-year-old member of the Irish Republican Army who went on a protest hunger strike 66 days ago has died.
The bin lids, and I knew that Bobby was dead. This was before mobile phones, before all of those modern means of communication. And I remember getting up, going out my sister's back door, and going up the alleyway, the entry, in Oakmont Street it was, onto Beachmount, onto Cavendish Street, and Colette, my wife, we lived quite close. She was with the other women, battering the bin lids. And I remember walking to the Sinn Féin office, and the Falls Road was aflame. So, Sinn Féin.
I would be very surprised if this doesn't mark the beginning of the end of English rule in Ireland. As far as I'm concerned, there'll be a black flag out of my house, certainly. We'll see, I think, a lot of people who wouldn't have been involved before.
Aren't we in the middle of a huge provisional propaganda campaign here?
What with that? What Dickens difference about that? This nonsense about provisional campaigns of propaganda. Sure, aren't we in the middle of a vicious British propaganda campaign and nobody says anything about that? This is nonsense. Look, the people around here, if they're going to support the provisionals, they'll decide to do that, and they'll not be told by anybody who they would support. And if the provisionals were to go political, without being military, tomorrow, vast numbers of people would support them. Of course they would. The English must get out. They must get out, and they must be put out by any means that we can muster.
In 1983, I was elected as MP for West Belfast. And to be honest, I never had any notion of being a candidate, never had any notion of being an MP. I also wanted to represent the people. I didn't want for a second to go into the British House of Commons, into the gallery, to swear an oath of allegiance to an English Queen or any of the rest of that. I was avowedly abstentionist and remain so to this day. I was also elected as the party president, as the Uachtaráin of Sinn Féin. I'm a team player, and I believe in building teams, and I believe in collective leadership, and I believe in democratic centralism and all of that. That had been my experience through all of my lives of activism, and here I am, I'm in my mid-30s, and I have been given responsibility. So I have to look at, with others, what we do about it, and that's when we formed a sort of a kitchen cabinet, and some of them ended up being the same core group for about 40 years of struggle.
And I declare that the person elected to serve as member for the said constituency is Gerard Adams.
In the course of an election campaign, a car with election workers was stopped by the RUC, and they tried to take from the car the Irish national flag. The guys in the car were flying the flag, and it was of no offence to anyone. It was in a strongly Republican nationalist neighbourhood. So I intervened to try and calm the situation, and ended up being arrested. And I arrived into court. I was very conscious that there was something untoward, the sixth sense of danger. I actually asked my solicitor, could we stay in the court during the lunch break? And he went and made inquiries and discovered that we couldn't. But we left the court and we get into the system of traffic and so on, and I then relaxed just as we were passing the City Hall. And then there were a number of very loud cracks. Bits of the car window come in around me, and I was hit in the upper body and the shoulders and the back. Poor cabin was hit as well. He was driving. I screamed, "Don't stop, keep driving," which he did. Sean Keenan was behind us, slumped in the seat, seemed to be quite seriously shot. He was shot in the face. Thankfully, we all recovered. They were arrested almost immediately after the shooting. I didn't waste my time worrying about the guys or hating the guys or getting annoyed about the guys who shot me. I'm not saying I would have loved to go out for a pint with them or any of the rest of that, but you just get on with it. And our homes and our offices, the Sebastopol Street office, the Connolly House office, were subjected to rocket attack, to gun attack, to bomb attack, to Petra bomb attack, to attack by the state forces as well as by unionist paramilitaries. So you either go under or you go on. And apart from taking necessary security precautions, I never really let it get in on me, because then you couldn't do the work that you were trying to do. None of that's meant to be bravado. Not that I go around thumping my chest. I don't want anybody to attack me. I've been blessed with very bad assassins. When IRA volunteers were killed, generally speaking, they got a Republican funeral, and that meant they were buried with the tricolour and so on. So somewhere in the innards of British Counterinsurgency Committee, they said, look, we can't very well be portraying these folks as gangsters and the rest of it if they are being given military honours or they're being given a Republican funeral and the church is part of this. So they got the Catholic hierarchy to ban the tricolour from being brought into the church. They also got the Irish News, one of the main newspapers in the north, to forbid the carrying of the word volunteer in death notices. But then the British Army and the RUC were brought in to police these funerals. And that led to long confrontations, like for days. That became known as the Battle of the Funerals.
There have been many Republican funerals throughout the past 15 years. There has been trouble at none of them whatsoever. The trouble has only begun because of the new policy of the RUC in attempting to prevent these funerals. They have created this problem, not us.
It became, I suppose, a battle of wills between Republican families who had lost loved ones and the authorities, including the Catholic hierarchy and the British forces. And when 3 volunteers were killed at Gibraltar and their remains were brought home, the families put out an appeal for the British Army and for the RUC to stay away, that they wanted to bury their people in peace. And that funeral was attacked infamously by, again, an agent of the British forces, a loyalist man called Michael Stone. And then the funerals of those who died in the attacks in Milltown Cemetery were also the subject of a huge controversy when 2 British undercover soldiers drove into the funerals, and those soldiers were attacked and killed. And then the entire establishment landed on the people of West Belfast. We were described as the terrorist community, as savages, those who had been praised for defending the mourners from the gunman who was throwing grenades and opening fire with short arms, were now condemned as being scum. And we were demonised is not too strong a word. We were. Our hands couldn't be shook. The broadcasting ban at one level was absurd, but at another level, it meant that people were robbed of the right to information, because the government didn't trust them to receive this. In the South, there was censorship of Sinn Féin, and there had been for decades. The Brits were later to introduce that in the North, censorship from the media, the inability of the media to broadcast Sinn Féin representatives' voices and so on. Now, some enterprising broadcasters tried to get around that by dubbing actors' voices.
Well, I don't know the mechanics of what happened yesterday, but you cannot justify... made a mess of it. Oh dear. Well, I don't know the mechanics of what happened yesterday, but you cannot divorce, and this is not a justification for what happened, because I don't believe what happened is justifiable. Whatever the intention was, the end result was disastrous. That's it. That wasn't bad.
Oh, I think obviously that all of us have to persuade each other about the type of new Ireland we shape out. But I mean, the British government is saying now, by its predetermined policy, that nationalists have to remain in a partitioned island.
For a long time it was responding to what was being imposed upon us. And then we started to think ourselves through from merely a culture of resistance into a culture of change. The word peace had been hijacked, and peace was being used as part of the propaganda against Republicans and nationalists generally. Peace, as it was interpreted then by the establishment, it meant the defeat of Republicans and nationalists. There was a huge step change in Republican thinking. But what it meant was that a political party in Ireland had agreed to peace as an objective. But I went looking for someone to get in contact with the different factions. A number of priests who I contacted wouldn't do it, but Father Alex Reid, who I had met in the prison when he was visiting us at different times, did agree, and Father Des Wilson hosted talks. That was the start of a process in looking at peace and how you get peace and continuing the conversation. They saw it as part of their vocation as priests to be peacemakers, and they were very progressive. My argument with them was people should not be condemning the IRA unless they can come up with an alternative. Go and get an alternative. Go and get an alternative that you can pursue objectives, Republican objectives, peacefully. And I'd be the first to embrace that. That became the source of very thoroughgoing discussions. They then went off and they were trying to put these points to the bishops, trying to put these points to the leaders of the other political parties. Father Reid wrote to John Hume and asked John Hume would he meet with me. And John immediately agreed to meet. John and I met in Clonard Monastery with Father Reid, and we commenced a lengthy and secret discussion. We came to trust each other in terms of our common aim of trying to develop towards a peaceful Ireland. Those talks inadvertently became public when we were spotted together, and that then caused a huge brouhaha. John was vilified in the southern media. But in fairness to him, he saw it off. He continued to talk to me. Those who may have disliked my politics were to a certain degree reassured by John Hume's involvement. And those who disliked John Hume's were in some way reassured by my involvement. There is too much made of the fact that I carried Thomas Bagney's coffin. What happened on the Shankill Road, the bombing on the Shankill Road, was totally and absolutely wrong. And remember also another IRA action which was totally and absolutely wrong, Enniskillen. John Hume and I were talking in the course of that, and we continued to talk despite Enniskillen, which was the right thing to do. And we continued to talk despite what happened on the Shankill, and we continued to talk despite what happened at Grey Steel, and despite the actions by British forces. Because remember, the British had not given up on pursuing militaristic objectives. The talks with John Hume led to meetings between our respective party leaderships. As well as Father Reid briefing the Irish government, John Hume was also briefing the British government. Well, it would be wrong to think that we had a perfect blueprint, but we had established for ourselves a number of strategic objectives, and that included internationally trying to win support for the Irish cause, for all-party talks, for a peace process. So while we were trying to make connections with the various parties here in Ireland, we were doing exactly the same thing, particularly in the United States of America.
When I was in Northern Ireland, the thing that impressed me most was the obvious, deep desire of people in both communities for peace. It was overwhelming, it was palpable, it was loud, it was unambiguous, it was exuberant, it was determined. It seems to me that that alone is enough to send a message to those who would resort to bombs and bullets that their ways are the ways of the past, and that the people cannot be denied the future they have decided upon.
But from now on, they will make that argument by democracy and by democracy alone, by the power of argument, not by guns or bullets or bombs or any of the rest of the paraphernalia of violence that have done such damage to this province over these past years. That surely is something worth coming to an agreement for.
Differences have arisen. As a result of these differences, many people have died, have lost their lives. What is the sense of continuing with that mutual slaughter when they could sit down and discuss peace?
We here in Ireland followed what was happening in South Africa and supported the anti-apartheid movement. And when Madiba was released from prison, and I remember watching the footage of him coming out with Winnie, and I remember crying and applauding, you know. And I feel like crying now just thinking back of the imagery of it. He was a global figure. Unfortunately, there isn't a global figure of his magnitude about now. Myself and Martin McGuinness met him many times. We had been engaged in developing a peace strategy, and we were making it up as we went along, and that first big engagement with the ANC leadership vindicated what we had been doing, because they had been doing the same thing. They had succeeded in ending apartheid.
We give our support for peace, for an end to the conflict in Ireland, and hope that all parties will, in the end, copy the experience that we have been through.
The partition of Ireland has been a failure. British rule in Ireland has been a failure. Unionist rule in Ireland has been a failure.
We want the British government to establish real talks, excluding no one, involving everyone. We learned an awful lot about negotiation and a face-to-face dialogue, but also in terms of how you bring about a process of change and how you adapt negotiations and make them a mode of struggle.
We lived, I think, incredible lives when you consider all that has happened in the North for the last 30 years and the reality that a lot of violence was used by the British Army, by the RUC, by the Loyalists. And of course, in a situation like that, and look at South Africa, look at the Middle East, you can clearly see that in situations where people believe that they're being discriminated against, treated unjustly, oppressed, people will fight back. I mean, the reason why we had a peace process was because the leadership of Sinn Féin worked very, very hard to develop that peace process. Gerry Adams worked very hard with John Hume. I was given the task on behalf of the Sinn Féin leadership to engage with representatives of the British government at the beginning of the 90s. And we, of course, did a lot of work with Albert Reynolds and with the Irish government and other representatives of the Irish government. And we worked hard within Nationalist Ireland.
And of course, the big game shifter was the Good Friday Agreement. For the first time, we got an inclusive, full involvement of all the players in a process to bring about some sort of an accord, an agreement, a means to plot our way out of conflict. But the other big achievement was the conversion of what was essentially an armed uprising and an armed group with a smaller political configuration in Sinn Féin, that politics came to have primacy.
The leadership of Ogie and Ahern has formally ordered an end to the armed campaign. This will take effect from 4 p.m. this afternoon. All IRA units have been ordered to dump arms. All volunteers have been instructed to assist the development of purely political and democratic programs through exclusively peaceful means. Volunteers must not engage in any other activities whatsoever.
I'm accused all the time of being a member of the IRA, and begrudgers and others, and perhaps people who are genuinely interested, use my denials of IRA membership in some way to impugn my character, they allege. I was in the IRA, and if I tell a lie about that, then I can't be believed on any other issue. So let me be very, very clear about this. I have never disassociated myself from the IRA. And I never will, until the day I die. Now, that isn't to say that the IRA were right all the time. No, the IRA were not right all the time. And the IRA did things which should not have been done. But as an organisation, mostly a working class, but not exclusively men and women, who stood up against a huge force with all of the paraphernalia of media, compliant media, censorship, all of that, and a compliant and collaborating government at times in Dublin. For them to resist, for that group of people to resist for as long as they did, I think deserves huge credit, which is not to take away from the suffering of those who were injured or killed by the IRA or their families. But if you watch all the resistance movements in the world, the IRA is probably one of the very few that wasn't quashed, was one of the very few that was able to embrace an opportunity to move from military actions, to take itself off the stage, to exit stage left, and to leave the future for people to develop as they see fit using peaceful and democratic means. And I think that's to the huge credit that they were prepared as undefeated resistance fighters, freedom fighters, people who were agents of change, saying, okay, this is a way forward and people don't have to be killed, so we're going to embrace it. And I think that's to their great, great, great credit. People voted. People voted across the island of Ireland in a very, very clear majority for this agreement. So I think that's an indication of what's possible when you have leadership and when you have political will. People will respond. What we did here, we did it for our children and our grandchildren. We did it for the Unionists as well as for the Republicans. Apart from anything else, that proves that conflict is a human creation. And like all creations made by human beings, they can be undone. We are the first generation, the first who have a peaceful and democratic way to end the union with Britain. Wolfe Tone 200 years ago didn't have it. The men and women in 1916 didn't have it. Bobby Sands didn't have it. This is the first time there is an ability to decide on our own future. We lost Martin McGuinness. We had planned a transitional, generational change in the party, and he was so looking forward to coming out of that position, because we in Sinn Féin want the very maximum of change, you know. I used to slag Mark that getting him out of a crowd was like getting a drunk out of a pub. He would have a word and a shake hands and a bit of crack with everybody he met, where he would end up running late because he was chatting and talking. And there are people who will go through life and they will do well. Really, no matter what circumstance they fall into, they will survive. And by doing well, I mean, you know, I don't mean extraordinarily or extravagantly well. I just mean get through life. But there are people who won't. And that they need a help. They need a hand. They need a service. They need a kindness, they need an embrace or a hug, and they need society to be moulded to suit them. You know, you can't judge society on the number of millionaires you have. As James Connolly famously said, you have to judge society by the quality of life of its lowest class. Martin had an eye for all that.
He's for us.
This is a continuum of struggle. We haven't got to the end of it yet, but we're well on the road. And while we did it for us, for the people of Ireland and the people of Britain, it also shows that it could be done elsewhere.
One of our greatest achievements has been, with John Hume and others, to build a peace process. And we have to persuade our unionist neighbours to support a new and agreed Ireland in which orange and green can live together in prosperity and harmony. We have so much in common. We have to ensure that everyone's rights are underpinned, and an agreed Ireland has to guarantee unionists their rights. The future is for the people to decide peacefully and democratically. Republicanism has never been stronger. This is our time. We will grow even stronger in the future, but leadership means knowing when it's time for change. And that time is now. I will not be standing for the Dáil in the next election. This is also my last Ardèche.
For me, it all comes down to the need for people to be empowered, for people to have a sense of themselves. That while I believe firmly that one person can make a difference, I think the sum total of everybody making a stand, everybody trying to be tolerant, respectful, but at the same time standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. So it worked for Ireland, and it will continue to work for Ireland. Why can't it work elsewhere? What's wrong with people sitting down and talking? What's wrong with people working out agendas which deal with injustice or inequality or discrimination? Why can't we make it a better world? We're simply trying to make our part of the world a better place, but why can't that work? The lessons of the Irish peace process could be utilised in the Middle East. It could bring about peace in other places that are just dreadfully troubled. And I think it's our duty to make change, but it would be, I think, an encouragement to people, the same as people in struggle in other parts of the world, by them being successful. I presume that I'll continue to be an activist in some capacity or other until I cease to be. And yes, 60 years is a long time. Come back and when I'm 70 years at it.
Stride like a